This is a real interview, translated into English. You can find the original story via the link in the description. Hi, my name is Mikhail. I live in the Czech Republic. I've been living here for about 4 years now. During all this time, I've mostly stayed in one city, Brno. At first, it took me some time to get used to living here, but eventually, everything started to make sense. I do travel from time to time, of course, but not too often, so my life is mainly based here. I moved to the Czech Republic from Kiev, Ukraine. When I first arrived, I had to figure out how life works in a new country and what my next steps should be. I decided to move to the Czech Republic to study because I was already seriously thinking about getting an education abroad and trying to figure out what option would make the most sense for my future. One of the main reasons was that higher education in the Czech Republic can be free at public universities if you study in Czech. On top of that, the country has several well-known technical universities. I looked into different options, and one of the specializations that really caught my attention was microelectronics. At that moment, this field seemed very promising and actually made sense for long-term career growth. I didn't really want to study in Ukraine. After talking to friends and people who had studied at Ukrainian universities, I noticed a clear pattern. Only a very small percentage of graduates actually ended up working in their field. Many people received diplomas that they couldn't really use later on. That outcome didn't make sense to me, and I didn't want to repeat that path. I wanted a degree that would be recognized internationally and give me real opportunities in the future. That's why studying abroad seemed like the right move. When choosing a country, the Czech Republic stood out first of all because education here is affordable, and in many cases, free. Financially, this factor really made sense for me. Also, on a more personal level, the Czech Republic just felt right. It's hard to explain logically, but emotionally it felt closer, and I felt like I could eventually get used to life here. Another reason was that my father had an acquaintance in the Czech Republic who was supposed to help me during the first period after arrival. In reality, that support didn't really work out as expected, but at the time, it still influenced my decision. Before entering the university, I studied Czech at a language school. I spent about 8 months taking Czech language courses in Brno. That period helped me get used to the language and daily life in the country. After that, I applied and successfully got into the university. If I briefly describe my experience with the language school, I'd say everything was more or less fine. I personally didn't have any serious problems. From my point of view, most difficulties students face are problems they create for themselves. If you do things properly, prepare for nostrification, pass the required exams, get the necessary Czech language certificate, the whole process actually makes sense and works quite logically. I didn't have problems with nostrification or university admission because I prepared in advance and took everything seriously. I think I was quite a conscious and prepared person when I moved here. In general, I believe that one of the biggest problems for students, and people in general, not only here, is the inability to search for information properly. You can see it all the time in student groups and forums. People ask very basic questions instead of trying to figure out the answers on their own. Instead of typing a clear question into Google and checking a few sources, people repeat the same questions over and over again. And if someone struggles with such basic things, they will most likely struggle later with studying abroad or trying to settle in another country. So yes, I honestly believe that if you have basic critical thinking, a working brain, and the ability to process information, then everything becomes quite manageable. You can study, find a job, and eventually settle in another country without unnecessary drama. At the beginning of my program, there were around 40 people in my group. By the end, only about 12 or 13 were left. So yes, a very large number of students dropped out during the first year, usually because they couldn't get used to the system or didn't fully understand how it works. It's important to understand that not everyone who dropped out immediately went back home. Some people tried to stay and basically went for a second round, enrolling again, switching programs, or looking for another way to remain in the country while trying to figure out their next steps. It's a bit difficult for me to judge everyone's paths in detail, because most people in my group were actually Czech or Slovak. There were only 3 Russian-speaking students in total, including me. I personally left the program after the second year, but it was a conscious decision. I realized that this specialization wasn't really what I wanted to do long-term. It simply stopped making sense for me. So I decided to change my field, reapplied, and started studying again. In my case, it wasn't a failure. It was a deliberate and logical change of direction. As for others, local students also drop out quite actively, especially during the first year. This is not only a foreign student issue. Many locals also struggle to get used to the academic pressure and strict requirements. One of the reasons why the numbers look so dramatic is that many people enroll mainly to get a visa. This is especially common among international students. They get admitted, but then they simply don't attend classes. Naturally, they get expelled pretty quickly, because this approach doesn't make sense in the long run. The logic behind this behavior is usually very simple. They want to extend their legal stay for a bit longer, maybe another semester or half a year, and during that time, try to figure out another option to stay in the country. The problem is that many of these people don't really have a clear plan. They don't know what they want to study, where they want to work, or what steps they need to take next. Instead of preparing properly, they just delay decisions and hope that everything will somehow work out. From my perspective, this is exactly where many people struggle. Not because the system is impossible, but because they come without preparation, without understanding the rules, and without a clear goal. And if you don't know what you're aiming for, it's very easy to drop out or lose your status instead of actually managing to settle in. That's why I strongly believe that preparation and conscious decision-making are absolutely key if you want to stay, study, and eventually settle in another country successfully. Yes, the system here is quite different, and that actually makes sense once you understand how it works. In the Czech Republic, universities mostly follow the Bologna system, which is based on credits. It's very different from what many people are used to in Russia or Ukraine. Back home, it's often possible to negotiate, retake exams multiple times, or somehow figure things out along the way. Here, that approach simply doesn't work. There are no automatic passes, no informal agreements, and no shortcuts. Either you studied the material, passed the exam, and earned the credits, or you didn't. If you fail, you don't get the credit, and that immediately affects your academic progress. There are also strict credit requirements. For example, in the first year, during the first semester, you usually need to earn around 15 credits. Over the full academic year, you must earn at least 30 credits. And over the entire bachelor's program, whether it takes 3 or 4 years, you need a total of 180 credits. Only after that can you take your final exams and defend your thesis. Because of this structure, many students struggle right from the start. It takes time to get used to this system. If you fall behind in one semester and don't manage to catch up, the university doesn't really give you much room to recover. You either keep up or you drop out. Another big difference is responsibility. No one runs after you. No one reminds you constantly. You are expected to figure out everything yourself. Deadlines, requirements, exam rules, credit counts. If you don't take this seriously, you won't last long. That's why the dropout rate is much higher here than in many post-Soviet universities. It's not necessarily because the material is harder, but because the system is stricter and much less forgiving. Many students simply can't get used to this level of independence and responsibility. In the end, this system works well for people who come prepared, understand the rules, and know why they are here. For them, everything makes sense. But for those who arrive without a clear plan or discipline, it becomes very easy to drop out before they ever get a real chance to settle down, academically or professionally. If I look at university education in the Czech Republic in general, I'd say it really depends on the field. In my own specialization, I'd say more than 90% of the subjects are genuinely useful. There isn't much water or meaningless theory. Most courses are practical, relevant, and clearly connected to real life and future work. From that perspective, I don't really have complaints. The education makes sense, and you understand why you are studying each subject. However, the situation can be very different in humanities. For example, my girlfriend studies at Masaryk University, and there you can really struggle with certain subjects, not because they are intellectually deep, but because of how they are organized and graded. There are some courses with very strict lecturers who sometimes demand strange or unclear things. A simple example. There was a subject, something like philosophy or cultural studies. Every week, students had to write an essay of about 5,500 characters. People genuinely tried, followed all the stated requirements, and took the task seriously. In the end, the entire group received the lowest possible grade. When students asked why, the lecturer said that the essays lacked certain references, even though this requirement had never been mentioned or explained. So at that point, students had to figure out what was actually expected, even though it wasn't written anywhere. The problem is that all these grades are later summed up at the end of the semester. If you collect several low grades like this, your final average becomes very poor, and that directly affects whether you pass the subject or end up retaking it, or even drop out of the program. Situations like this do happen. Not everywhere, but they exist. And sometimes you really have to figure out how to survive such courses, because logic and effort alone don't always help. Another issue is that some subjects are hard to justify at all. It's not clear why they exist in the program. On top of that, studying for them can be unnecessarily complicated. For example, to write an essay, you might need two specific books. One is provided, but the second one you have to buy. And every week it's a different book, costing 200 to 300 Czech crowns each time. You can't download these books legally. Piracy is taken seriously here. Libraries often don't have enough copies, so students have to get used to constantly spending money just to complete assignments for a subject that doesn't even feel important. So overall, my view is this. In technical and applied fields, education in Czech universities is strong and practical. In some humanities programs, you may struggle not because of knowledge, but because of unclear rules, strict grading, and questionable course structure. If you're prepared, motivated, and understand how the system works, you can adapt and eventually get used to it and settle down academically. But you definitely need patience and the ability to navigate these quirks without losing motivation. My current field of study is audio engineering, and that's what I'm studying right now at VUT. In simple terms, the program is focused on sound, technology, and everything connected to audio. By the third year, the curriculum includes a lot of hands-on practice, studio work, developing different audio devices, working with sound processors, audio effects, and similar things. It's not just theory. It's very practical, and everything actually makes sense in real-life terms. I chose this specialization quite consciously. I had already been working with audio quite seriously for more than a year before enrolling. Before that, I honestly didn't even figure out that it was possible to study something like this formally at a university. When I realized that such a program exists, everything immediately clicked. One big difference compared to some other programs is that our subjects and lecturers are generally very adequate. We don't have situations where you write endless essays for no clear reason, or where requirements are vague and confusing. Everything is technical, structured, and logical, so you don't constantly have to figure something out just to understand what the teacher wants. Most complaints from students in my program are actually about subjects like physics or mathematics. People often say, "Why do we need this?" But in reality, these subjects are essential. They help you understand more complex topics later. Without that foundation, you would really struggle to understand how audio systems work or what's happening under the hood. Personally, I see these subjects as necessary. At first, it can be tough, but over time, you get used to this way of learning and start seeing how everything connects. Another thing I really like is how the system handles credits. This time, I didn't have to retake some subjects because the credits were transferred from my previous program. They were recognized automatically. That's extremely convenient and definitely reduces the chances that students drop out just because of bureaucracy. So, overall, I'm happy with my specialization. I didn't end up here by accident. It was a conscious choice. And right now, this field feels like something I can truly grow in and eventually settle down professionally. Here, the process was actually very simple and straightforward. Everything made sense from the beginning. I didn't leave the university itself, I just switched from one specialization to another within the same university. There were no serious difficulties. I finished studying in my first program, then applied to a new one without any drama or confusion. After that, I submitted an official request to the dean's office, asking them to recognize the subjects I had already passed. In the Czech system, if you passed a subject with more than 60 points out of 100, it can usually be transferred, so you don't need to retake it. You don't have to fight the system or figure something out through unofficial ways. The rules are clear. In my case, this worked out well, because the new specialization was quite close to the previous one. If I had switched to something completely different, for example from a technical field to a humanities program, none of this would have been recognized, and I would have had to start from zero. In that situation, many students simply drop out because restarting everything can be very demotivating. I was studying at the same university, even on the same faculty, and many subjects overlapped. There is a specific system that measures how similar the subjects are. If the overlap is more than about 70%, the subject gets recognized. If not, you have to take it again. Once you get used to how this system works, it actually feels quite fair and logical. So overall, the transition was smooth, structured, and predictable. No unnecessary bureaucracy, no chaos. Everything really made sense. As for my social circle, after 4 years in the Czech Republic, it has changed quite a bit. I still have a couple of Russian-speaking friends. With Czechs, I didn't communicate that much at first. It took time to get used to the language, the mentality, and the way people interact here. Things started to change when I began dating a Czech girl. Now my girlfriend is Czech. Because of that, I naturally started interacting more with locals. As for close friends, I wouldn't really say I have many Czech friends yet. I have a few acquaintances, but interestingly, most of them are actually Slovaks rather than Czechs. That goes back to the time when we were studying microelectronics together. So at this point, I wouldn't say I have close Czech friends yet, more like friendly contacts and people I feel comfortable talking to. But that's also something you slowly figure out over time when living in another country. Yes, there are quite a lot of differences. The mentality is very different. People here live differently. They have different values, and they see and understand the world in another way. That became noticeable almost immediately. And at first, I needed some time to get used to it. Some things genuinely surprised me, and some felt unusual in the beginning. The way people communicate, react to situations, or approach relationships doesn't always make sense right away if you come from a different cultural background. At the same time, I strongly believe that if two people are mature enough and at least reasonably thoughtful, they can always figure something out together. Cultural differences don't disappear, of course, but they don't automatically turn into serious problems either. Misunderstandings will happen anyway. That's normal in any relationship, especially intercultural ones. The key point is not to ignore them and not to let them grow into real conflicts. If you talk things through in time, most situations can be resolved calmly. In my opinion, people usually run into serious problems or even emotionally drop out of relationships, not because cultures are different, but because they stop communicating and trying to understand each other. The hardest moments of my relocation and migration over these 4 years were definitely related to visa issues. And I think this is not just my personal problem. It applies to most foreigners here. The visa application system in the Czech Republic honestly doesn't really make sense. There's basically only one office where you can apply, and in August it turns into complete chaos. People literally sleep outside just to get a spot in line. You also have to keep in mind that most student visas are renewed every year. Every year there are more people. New students arrive, others need to extend their visas, and everything depends on university schedules and deadlines. Each time it feels like a race. You're constantly trying to submit all the documents on time and hoping nothing goes wrong. Mentally, this is something many people struggle with. You're under constant pressure because your legal status depends on it. One small mistake, and you might lose your right to stay. Financially, it hits hard as well. Insurance prices have increased significantly. Every time you renew your visa, you need to show proof that you have enough money in your bank account, a fairly large amount. Right now, it's about 90,000 Czech crowns that you must have every single year. On top of that, the visa application itself costs around 2,500 crowns, and health insurance is mandatory. At the moment, insurance costs about 11,000 to 12,000 crowns per year, and you have to pay for it even if you don't use it at all. So every year you spend a significant amount of money just to maintain your legal status. When you're a student or just starting out, you really have to figure something out early, financially, mentally, and strategically. Otherwise, it becomes very hard to plan your future or even think seriously about whether you want to settle down in the country long term. For my side jobs, I've been working in electronics for quite a long time. Since I already had technical skills, I started by fixing computers and phones for friends, then for friends of friends. Little by little, it grew naturally. People would recommend me, ask for help, and that's how I got more small jobs. Over time, it all started to make sense as a steady side income. Eventually, I ended up working mostly in this area. Here in Brno, I repair laptops and desktop computers, mainly doing hardware fixes and basic electronics work. Nothing fancy, but practical and reliable. At the beginning, I had to figure something out on my own. How things work here, how to find clients, what people expect, and how much to charge. It wasn't always easy, and at times I did struggle, especially during the first months when everything was new and uncertain. Still, this kind of work helped me support myself and feel more confident. It made life here feel more manageable and gave me some stability. I wouldn't say this is something I want to do forever, but for now, it works. Maybe later, when things are more stable, I'll decide whether I want to settle down here professionally or move in a completely different direction. When it comes to fitting into a team, my experience was actually very positive. A lot depends on the company and on the type of work you do. If you work, for example, in a warehouse or in a technical role and treat your team with basic respect, there are usually no problems at all. People in the Czech Republic are just people. You can communicate with them, work together, and even become friends at work. In that sense, workplace dynamics here make sense and feel quite natural. The most important thing, of course, is language. During my first year, when I was just starting to look for part-time jobs, my Czech was still quite weak. Because of that, I sometimes struggled to communicate properly. I wanted to talk more, joke around, and really be part of the group, but I didn't always know how to express myself. It took time to get used to speaking Czech in real working situations. Over time, things got much easier. As my language improved, I started to feel more confident. I could finally figure out how workplace communication works here, what is appropriate, how people interact, and how to behave naturally in a team. I officially started working about a year after moving to the Czech Republic. By that time, I was already enrolled at the university, and my status allowed me to work legally. That's when I really began gaining work experience alongside my studies. Balancing university and part-time work wasn't very difficult for me. At the beginning, everything felt new and a bit chaotic. The university system, online platforms, assignments, projects, deadlines. The first weeks were overwhelming, and you really need time to get used to how everything is organized. But after about a month or a month and a half, everything became clear. I understood how the system works, where to find information, how to submit assignments, and how to plan my time. Once that clicked, the whole routine finally made sense. At that point, I felt that I had really ended up in a rhythm that worked for me. I had enough time not only for studying and working, but also for my own projects and personal life. So overall, adaptation was much smoother than many people expect. If you're willing to learn, stay organized, and take responsibility, it's absolutely realistic to study, work, and gradually settle down in a new country at the same time. My name is Artyom, and I've done around 2,000 interviews with people who moved to completely different countries. I hope you enjoyed this story, and that it maybe helped you improve your English. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.